Hello guys, David Vose here again. Beautiful day here out here on the old paradise, Red Mesa, and here in New Mexico. Still a lot of clouds and sprinkling going on. Beautiful day. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Guys, we're gonna go into some information. I'm sure most of this you've never heard, but we're gonna explore the depths and the intrigue of the conspiracy that was concocted by human beings and governments around the world to hide the truth from us and to make us believe that Jerusalem that's over there in Palestine is the new Jerusalem or the true Jerusalem or the true religion, our faith, but in reality it is the worship of the devil. And this is why it is called Babylon. Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of the harlots. So it's the other covenant, right? And yeah, she's teaching the world lies and deception and reigning over the kings of the earth in a brutal manner. And so we're about to go into a great tribulation. And as we've shown here before, Book of Revelation, chapter 18, she will be destroyed with fire. Jesus did walk there in Jerusalem, that is where we have Herod's temple in Palestine, but it's not where he set up his 12 apostles and the 72 or the Sanhedrin. He did that down in Heliopolis, there where John the Baptist was preaching at Bethany, or the house of On, the house of John. But he did go up to Jerusalem there in Palestine, where the Pharisees met him and began to interrogate him and seek to find accusation against him. But he would not bow down to their deity, and he would not keep their Sabbath. And he redeemed that woman they were about to stone for adultery. That woman was Mary Magdalene. And we're going to tell you the story about the true temple, and we're going to give you some literal historical evidence and show you what you've been missing, what they have hidden from you, and the lies that they've told. And it's going to blow your mind. So we're going to start today. You can see on your screen, we covered this yesterday, where we showed where the true Bethel and Jerusalem and Bethlehem and these places were, and Solomon's temple at Luxor. You should go back and watch that. It's very important. If you haven't watched that, watch it first. And you might go back to the video just before that one, because these are kind of all in a series. But today we're going to go over some more evidence that they've hidden from you about where this Jerusalem really was and where the priesthood of Zadok was, which is the priesthood of John the Baptist. So let's see if AI actually knows this information, but just hiding it from us. What does she say about this temple there, the Jerusalem temple that was rebuilt at Heliopolis? While Josephus is the primary source of information about the Jewish temple at Heliopolis and the Zadokite priesthood associated with it, other sources do offer glimpses of potential allusions. Artapanus of Alexandria, a Hellenistic Jewish writer, potentially makes an uncertain allusion to the temple. While the details are scarce, the existence of such a reference suggests the temple's presence was known beyond Josephus's account. The sibling oracles? Who were the sibling oracles? What's that all about? There is so much being hidden from you, friends. The sibling oracles are literally Christian scriptures, and they are found in the group of scriptures that these early Coptic Christians believed in. And so some of the early Coptics were people that believed in the sibling oracles. Now that's something that we're going to talk about today. What does the sibling oracles have to do with the temple of Onius or John, who had the Zadokite priesthood. And why isn't somebody talking about this? I mean, because everybody knows that the Zadokite priesthood is the one that the Dead Sea Scrolls are about. That they wouldn't go up to the Jerusalem and Herod's temple. They wouldn't go there. They despised it, and they talked about the teacher of righteousness or the Zadokite priesthood. If indeed the Zadokite priesthood is at Heliopolis, Onias, the temple of On, which the whole world knows about On and Heliopolis, but never notices that there was a Zadokite priest named On that, with the syntax on the Eus, but it's On. That's how, Jonas or Jonius, sometimes it's just written different ways. But that's the Zadokite priesthood. And why then were there two different temples in different locations that Jewish people built at the same time after the destruction of Jerusalem? When they went into captivity, they came back, and two of the groups that built temples went to Egypt. One built the Elephantine Temple, and the other one up by Heliopolis, basically on the exterior area where Heliopolis once stood, where there was also another temple called Leontopolis, which is Leon or the lion. We could go into what that means, why they had a temple dedicated to Leo. Well, the Great Pyramid seems to have something to do with that as well. But if this is the Zadokite priesthood, what does it have to do with oracles? And the sibling oracles, what does that have to do with the Vestal Virgins? Because they certainly were oracles that women in various parts in Athens, they had these different oracles. And the oracles were always spoken through women in ecstatic dancing. It was the speaking of tongues, friends. It was the early church, the glossalia, and, the filling of the Holy Spirit, the flamens, the flames on their head, and the sacrament, and the holy wedding, and all of this is what these oracles were that were around the world. Well, people today don't understand because they're like, well, that's pagan, right? What does paganism have to do with early Christianity? Why were there Gnostics, Coptic Christians? Why did they have the whole Nag Hammadi library that literally is written kind of like Buddhism? And why were the early Christian scriptures linked to these sibling oracles? I'm going to show you that they're hiding so much from you. Why would we have this reference by Josephus telling us all of this, but almost nothing left about it other than, maybe some allusion there at the sibling oracles, but we won't talk about that or try to figure out what that's all about, right? Archaeological evidence and inscriptions. So there's archaeological findings such as a stela inscription containing the words land of Onius. Remember, guys, don't let the syntax, I should say the suffix of a name. So we always give this illustration. We have the name Paul. Well, in Greek, they would write it Apollo, Apollo, Apollyon, or Apollios. So if you saw the word Apollios or Apollyon, it would still be the word Paul with the suffix that is in English stuff like the end ing or the plural or the tense of the verb or all of this, the grammar, the syntax of the word. So when you see Onius, that's because they don't want you to know that is John. But in Greek, they didn't just write it John. Now in English, we just write John. We just write Paul. But we don't write Apollonius or something. And there was quite a bit of difference in the suffix and the way it's written, depending on the verb and the subject and all of these things. So Onius is the land of John. And it can't be a coincidence that the city of On was named the city of John or On for this reason. The city of Heliopolis, that was the way the Greeks, Helios, Helios was one of the sons of Cleopatra. He was a twin. His sister was Selena. Selena means the moon, and Helios means the sun. So it's the city of the sun, and the Egyptians used to say it was the house of Ra. The house of Ra is Pharaoh, who was the king or the ruler of the house of Ra. And the reason it's the house of Ra is because it's a circle. It's a rotation. And there are 12 houses in the rays of the sun. And there's the 12 months. And so there are 12 houses. And the pharaohs ruled over each of the houses. And this has come down to us. Even now today in Christianity, we have deacons, right? Who are priests. Priests, what do? They rule over houses, temples, right? He goes to prepare a house for thee, a mansion. There are many houses. There are 12 houses, and within each of the 12 houses, well, there's actually 24 houses, 12 in the day and 12 at night, but there are other houses within the house, chambers. And there are 3 deacons that rule over each house, subordinate to the 12 pharaohs or rulers. But these 12 pharaohs were of this Melchizedek or this Circorum or sacred order of the house. And so there were 12 men and 12 women. So they called it the house of the sun. But from the beginning, the Egyptians, 3000 BC, as far back as we have records, the Egyptians called this house of the sun because, as we've shown, it's the hub of the circuit, the Galilee, the Gilgal. So we know that when the Israelites crossed the river Jordan and set up the 12 stones, it wasn't the Jordan River. That in modern times they call it the Jordan River. But it's the great descent of the river of life, which is, as we showed, the Nile, which represents the spine, and Goshen is the brain, and all the little rivers that go through the brain and go out and, and right there in the center where Cairo is, that represents the pineal gland, is where all these rivers branch out from the Nile in one spot. The river divides, some rivers to the right and some to the left, and all going up into this area that looks like the brain. And along the Nile, the spine, there were 7 holy cities that represent the 7 chakras. And of course, the highest of this would be there at Heliopolis, the city of Ra, which, as we have said, is the geographical center of the entire globe. Literally, scientists have said that where the Pyramid of Giza sits, it is the geographical center of all land masses on Earth. And so the Egyptians said that this was the spot, the center of the original mound. Well, that's the same thing, what they're saying. How would they have known that 3000 BC? They didn't have planes, supposedly. They couldn't get up in the sky and see. How did they know that this place that we call Heliopolis, the city of Ra, the 12 houses of the sun, and the circuit, and the Gilgal, how could they know that that was the center of the mound, or the mountain, the Mount Zion, Shambhala, Eretz, right? This is the earth, Eretz, or Mount Ararat, that Noah, Anu, John, parked his boat. And all civilization landed there after the Great Flood. So they when they said the city of On, they were talking about the city of Noah, the city of On, where mankind began, the very peak, the top of the mound that rose up out of the mud. And of course, this is why they talk about Noah as one of the 8 or the Ogdod. And before that, there was the Ennead or the 9. And this goes back to Adam. All of the names, they're the chief of the Enneads is Atum or Atom, right? And so the chief of the Ogdod is On. And On is John today, if you were to say it. We say John. But this is back to Anu. So when Jesus looked at Peter and says, Peter, son of Jonas, again, it's Onius, son of John or son of Noah. Interesting that Jesus said, I will give you the keys of the kingdom. That what you open, no man can shut. And what you shut, no man can open. What are these keys? What are the keys of the kingdom? And they were the keys that were originally given to King David. And the keys that Jesus Christ had, the keys of death and Hades. Because Jesus went down into hell and got those keys. He conquered the devil. It was originally the devil who had these keys, the keys of death, the keys of the kingdom. But Peter was given the keys upon this rock, Cephas, the Greek name for the Father. Pontifex Maximus means the high priest, the chief high priest. He had the highest position. He oversaw the rituals and the calendar. He administered sacred law. He was the advisor, the interpreter of the dreams, the omens. Remember, Daniel was the interpreter of the king's dreams. He was prime minister. He was the role of the chief priest. He would oversee funerals, because it's very important in Egyptian times where when a king died or someone of importance, they had a ritual because they believed that this was not the end of life. They were teaching mankind the truth. This was a classroom. We came here, we were preparing ourselves for death. And the king didn't rule for might or power or fame. He was appointed and anointed over the process. The sacred priest was the rex sacrorum, but he was the king and queen. And they, like King David, possessed the keys of the kingdom. But the keys of David, at one point, was in the hands of a particular king, Hilkiah, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 22, verse 22. And it says that Eliakim was given the keys of the kingdom of David's house. But if you look at it, he wasn't the king. He was just a more or less prime minister who was being given authority over the house of the king. Because the king didn't rule by himself. The king and the queen were the chief. But they had a council. This was the Sanhedrin type thing. And there was 2 consuls that had certain power. They would rule each for a year simultaneously, both of them. And they could veto each other's stuff. But the Pontifex Maximus was the high chief priest over that council, like a prime minister today, or a prime servant, or a prime or chief priest. But so you get the idea that when Jesus, because it says in Revelation, Jesus has the keys of David. He holds the keys of David, which is the keys of the kingdom, that he may open, that no man may shut. They have all power. The keys of David is the keys of all the power on earth. And Jesus held that authority because he was the son of David, and therefore the promised Messiah who would hold those keys, but then one day bring everything in the universe together, the last enemy being death, and hand over the kingdom back to his father, to King David. But while a king was in office, such as the Messiah would have been, as Jesus was, he will administer that authority through his council of priests, the 72, the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin had a chief priest who basically held those keys and administered the power of the king, who would be Jesus. So Peter was given the keys not to replace Jesus, but only to officiate in the kingdom which was and belonged to Jesus. Now we see James the Just, a Zadokite priest, Jacob is his real name, but I don't know, for some reason in our Bibles he's James, right? Doesn't sound anything like Jacob, right? But was his name Jacob? Perhaps. Is that just an office title, as the father of Israel? Might have been. Sometimes their names, they name them these names to indicate their office. But Jacob, or James, made the decision above Paul, Peter, John, and slammed his gavel down, and he was called James, or Jacob the Just, which is the Greek word Zadokite, which is the Zadokite priesthood at Heliopolis, which is why Jacob James was taken to the pinnacle of the temple, which is the pyramid. And Jesus was the chief top cornerstone of this government, this mountain, 144,000 on the Mount of Zion, which is the Great Pyramid, which had originally 144,000 blocks, outer blocks. And the top one was more or less like burnished gold. It shines light. It would shine light because the light would reflect off of the top. It was polished. It was the eye of Osiris. So the kingdom is ruled from the top down. The 12 formed a council, and in that council there were 3 that ruled: the 2 consuls, and then the Pontifex Maximus. The Rex Sacrorum was above that whole council. That was the king and the queen. So Jesus and Mary Magdalene were the Rex Sacrorum. When Jesus left, James probably took that office as the King Melchizedek priest, high king priest position. We know that the scriptures say that heaven and earth came into being for James. The Bible, when it uses expressions like this, it's trying to tell you something. Like we've talked about when Jesus said that no man born of woman is greater than John. John, as we've seen, was the name for this city, right? The central location, the hill that rose up from the mire after the flood. And this was Mount Zion. And at the top was the great city of On, or John, or Anu, or Noah. So Noah, being John, will see how he could be the greatest man born of a woman. Well, how could Noah be greater than Adam? His, the father of all mankind before the flood. Well, he can't be. But Adam, you see, wasn't born of a woman. Now, the first and the greatest father that was ever born of a woman was Noah. When was Noah born? Noah was born 600 years before the flood. Now, if you add up all the dates in the book of Genesis, you got 1,656 years. If you take 600 years away from that, you've got 1,056 years. If you take Adam's 930 years of life away from that 1,056, you have a period of 126 years. Well, Adam was 130 when he had Seth. Now, I know this sounds a little bit confusing, but Seth was the first incarnation of Noah. And Seth lived 912 years. you add the 912 years on to the 130 years that Adam had lived until Seth was born, you find that Seth would have died 14 years before Noah was born. This is how the Bible tells you who is who. Because you see, Abel only lives a short time, has no genealogy, and is killed by his brother Cain. So Enoch's not born for another several hundred years. So Abel is reincarnated back again as Enoch. Both of these individuals was Jesus. We know this because Jesus was born and crucified from the founding of the world. He was killed from the founding of the world. The one who was killed from the founding of the world was Abel. And Cain, being the murderer, the liar and the murderer from the beginning, was Cain. So that was his brother, Yahweh, the I am vengeance, and Jesus was the I am the way, the truth, and the life. The book of Hebrews says that Abel's blood cries out in demand of a atonement, and the Lord is hearing it. Now, the character that we call Seth was the second in line from Adam. You don't include Abel because Abel died. He's the seventh in line from Adam is Enoch, and it doesn't include Abel. So we just go Adam, Seth. Seth is the second one. And Seth then died 14 years before Noah was born. So that means that Seth wasn't on the earth anymore when Noah was on the earth. There was a 14-year span, which is significant, 2 full weeks. That's a time of mourning. But Noah was the reincarnation of Seth. And Noah is On, who was also a father to mankind. But not like Adam, but after the flood, he was the father of everyone living. And then after Noah, we have Abraham, also exactly another 1,000 years from the birth of Noah. We have Abraham, who is the third angel. Now, if Adam is the first angel and Seth is the second angel, which is Noah, and James is Adam, John is Noah, then Abraham, who's born 292 years after the flood, would have had to have been Enosh. Enosh died 68 years before the flood, and if you put that together, it's exactly 360 years from the time that Abraham died as Enosh and came back as Abraham. The reason there's 360 years in between his death and his incarnation is because it was before the flood, so he couldn't come right then, because if he came after that immediately, he would have died in the flood. So 360 years is a period of 360 days in a year. It's a cycle, complete cycle. So it's the cycle. The next cycle is what it's symbolizing. And so Enosh becomes Abraham. And then we go on down the line with the 7 archangels. And each of these 7 archangels are ruling over a different 1,000 years. So then we have Abraham, who comes up during the 3rd millennium, and he is the father of all the nations. Again, the father of a multitude. This goes all the way down until the last 1,000 years, which is the last 1,000 years just now ending. And the 7 angels, each of them rule. Well, this tells us then that Noah was Seth in the next incarnation, and therefore the father that is the greatest man who ever lived, born of a woman, who then was James, or Jacob, as we have said. If you ever need anything, Jesus said, go to James, because heaven and earth came into being for James. Listen, there's no other way to understand this except to say that James was Adam. Yes, because heaven and earth came into being for Adam and Eve, and they were one, Adim. And so The greatest man that ever lived, but not born of a woman, was Adam. And the greatest man that ever lived that was born of a woman was Noah. But the book of Hebrews tells us about Melchizedek. Who was this man? Because Abraham went out and paid tithes to Melchizedek. And it was Melchizedek that anointed Abraham and transferred and gave him the rex sacrorum, or the king of the sacred duties of the sacrorum, the sacrament, and brought out bread and wine. So, who was this man, Melchizedek? With no genealogy, with neither beginning of days nor end of life. Well, Abel, who was conceived before sin was in the world, and also represents that spiritual child that was divorced or killed, martyred by his brother, the lower consciousness. And so Abel, in that higher consciousness, continued to incarnate, came back as Enoch, and then later on as Jesus Christ, and many other lives, but he died on that cross, and he said, "It is finished." And then he rose up and began to ascend, because before that, he was descending into the lower regions of the earth. But he reached the bottom and overcame hell, and now he began to ascend and raise the body up. Remember, when they saw Jesus, he said, "Touch me not, for I have not yet ascended unto my Father." So this was the place that he began to ascend, far above all heavens. Noah was the father of all men at that time, because he was the father of the 3 sons and their 3 daughters, and him and his wife, Noah and Naomi, were the king and the queen that ruled over these 8. And then after them, they had children, and they developed this government. But where Noah landed the boat on Mount Ararat, or the mount of the earth, the mound, it would have been the city of On, the center of all the geographical locations. And the temples that were built along the spine was to represent the 7 chakras. The entire temple and the entire religious organization and the mysteries were designed to veil and reveal in their own due time the glorification of the world, the reason why we're here, the advancement of the enlightenment, and how to attain unto it through the mystical revelation, the exaltation, and the receiving the great white robe and the crown. Everything happens because of that message, that mystery that was revealed to man through Enoch, which the Bible says in the book of Enoch would be the Messiah. Enoch was the second incarnation of Jesus Christ. The first one was Abel. El is his father. That's what Abel means. El is my father. And therefore, Adam is El. And Ada is spelled Da'id or Daoud, Diat or Diati with the suffix Dia, day. We got the word day from it. We have the word divine. And so sometimes divine or deity, that those are interchangeable. It refers to the light, which is the higher essence of being. It's the source of all the material universe, the light, which is the truth. And that light had 2 sons, which was the 2 egos, the 2 consciousnesses, the higher and the lower consciousness. Yahweh being the lower consciousness, the I am vengeance, and Jesus being the higher consciousness, which is I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so the spokesman for the Elohim was Jesus and Yahweh. But Jesus spoke, or he was the word, the angel's voice there on Mount Horeb, and the other voice, which is the angel that they chose instead, the angel that had my name in him, that he will not pardon your sins. That's the visible angel that manifested there with Moses and the 72, and they ate and drank with him. And they saw him face to face as a man would speak to his own brother. That is the angel who fell on the mountain. Sometimes they call it, that is Mount Zion, that is the original mountain of El and his two sons. All of this is talked about in every one of the ancient stories, the scriptural stories from each nation. They all trace their lineage back to Noah. And this was the great central location. And every other place in the world existed and was built based on that knowledge. So when we go to Isaiah and we see that Hilkiah was king and he gave the keys of the kingdom to Eliakim, that no man can open what he shuts and nobody could shut what he opens. He was not the king, but the prime minister for the king Hilkiah. So when Jesus, the king, gave the keys of the kingdom to Peter, Peter's office was prime minister of the other apostles. When Jesus died, James, who is called the brother of the Lord, who had the same genealogy and destiny, once Christ was no longer there, took the office of Rex Sacrorum, or king priest, and therefore was the teacher of righteousness, or the Zadokite teacher that the Dead Sea Scrolls speak of, and that we're going to show you was all interwoven with this Heliopolis and this government and all this astrological information that was in the mysteries, and the mystery schools was taken to Ephesus, and they made a tower there, and Artemis, which is their way of saying Hathor or Ishtar or Isis or Aphrodite. These women were representative of Eve. There are two women represented. Look at astrology today. You've got the Virgo, which is the Virgin Mother, and then right next to her is Libra with the scales of justice, and that's Mary Magdalene. So we've got the Virgin Mother Mary, and we've got Mary Magdala, which is Virgo and Libra. And so in the stories and the mythologies or the scriptures and the ancient mysteries, we always have these two women. So we must differentiate between them. One is wearing white and one is wearing black. Now, white means a virgin, obviously, and the veil is opened and you marry. But who is the widow? Well, remember, black dresses were for widows. They were married, but their husband died. Well, this is the problem, is there was a woman who was married to Yahweh. He was an abusive man, and he sent her away. Jesus redeemed her. Mother Eve was wearing the black robe because she'd gone through all this trouble, gone and partaken of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, wandering around. Yahweh cursed her and thrown her out into the wilderness. But then comes the Mary Magdala, and after Jesus redeems the widow and raises up her son, he marries and makes a new covenant. And now Mary Magdalene's adorned in white, because this is the new thing that we talked about, marriage, not the old covenant of slavery. But this is the purity and the love between Mary and Jesus, and she wears white. But don't you worry, because when Mother Eve was redeemed, her and Adam are going to have another wedding, and they're going to be reunited because she's been redeemed by having this heir. And just before the eternal kingdom of Christ has brought all things to nothing, in his second return, he comes to gather all things together and then hand it back unto his Father. And there will be a great wedding, the atonement of Adam and Eve will be dressed in white. But Mary Magdalene, Mary of the high priestess of the tower, she was a Syrian priestess, and in Cana, of the Canaanites, of the Phoenicians, of the lineage of the Miriam that was down at Dendera, or the temple of Hathor, which is the temple of Miriam or Mary. And so they had another priesthood up in Ephesus, and the high priestess of the tower was Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene wore white because this is the new covenant, and this is what all of our marriages are based on. She was completely spotless, no trace of sin. She was the bride of Christ because we're supposed to be virgin, chaste virgins, waiting for the Christ. And we're chaste virgins as the seven maidens or the church in her train. We're in the train of the marriage of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. However, the wedding that is still yet to come, because remember, Jesus and Mary Magdalene already got married. But the great wedding, which is going to be the atonement that redeems all the world and brings the kingdom to the entire world, is when Adam and Eve finally reunite. And they then have white, though for so long they had worn that black robe. So it was the Virgin Mother who is the one wearing the black, because she had to go through this dark night with her husband and conquer this world. And though her husband died, though they both had to separate, and the woman wandering around like in a wilderness in this world from her higher consciousness, she then wore the black robe. But remember, it's all an illusion, a delusion. It's an experience that we might learn, a classroom. You get your black robe while you're in class. But when you graduate all the degrees, you finally get your white robe. So the great wedding that we're waiting for is the wedding of Adam and Eve to be reunited, and the at-one-ment or the atonement occurs, and the graduation where you get your white robe and your crown. And we see Eve, Mother Eve, crowned with the crown of 12 stars, adorned with the sun. Okay, she was down there, being persecuted by the devil, but now she's adorned with the sun and away from the face of the serpent, and she gives birth to the child, which is the kingdom. So Mother Eve, Ishtar, Queen Esther, Mary, the Virgin Mother, had to wear a black robe as a priest. Mary Poppins is a representation of her. Notice that Mary Poppins is a teacher of children, represents all the children on this earth in the house. Well, then there's this funny guy who dances a lot and comes down the chimney. Dick Van Dyke, one of the funniest guys that ever was, and a good dancer and a really likable man. He comes down and he sings the children's songs. Well, he's a chimney sweeper, because you see, you've got to have those energies from above, because Mary's in the house teaching the children, and she knows that everything's going to be all right, but we've got to get that chimney swept, and we've got to dance with the chimney sweeper or the spirit. So there's a lot of all of these connotations. Remember, Elijah raised up the widow's son. Jesus came and also did the exact same thing. The widow of Nain. And look it up. Nain was the way they said the word Zarephath in the days of Jesus. Where in the days of Elijah, it was Zarephath. So the same place. And obviously, wherever this place was, Zarephath, which is almost up where Tyre was, it was a place that is probably Mount Carmel or the Nazareth, which is the city of the priests, the great prophets, the school of the prophets at Mount Carmel. And there is Cana, or the Canaanites. There is the northern area of the Canaanite woman, the Samaritan woman, who's sitting by the well. The well is the well of water. So Jesus, Elijah, Elisha all raised the widow's son because it's the priesthood. So Mary, the Virgin Mother, was the high priest of a priesthood at Heliopolis that no longer had a husband, and she was a widow. But she will be reunited again with her husband Adam at the return of Jesus Christ when he hands back the kingdom unto his Father, and we all get there to the great wedding. Jesus and Mary Magdalene's already been married. The wedding that's coming is the marriage of atonement, or the at-one-ment of Adam and Eve. The same story you'll find in Egypt, where Osiris marries Isis, but then there is Set, who was married to Nephthys. Now, Nephthys is the daughter of Geb, which is in the Greek is Gaia. So in the Egyptian it's Ge. And Nut, the sky. Remember, T's are silent in the Egyptian. This is why over in Mesoamerica they always have these T's that are silent, like Enochtic land. Well, it's Enoch's land. Teotihuacan. You don't pronounce the T, it's Enoch. So Nut is Nu, or An, right? Anu, heaven, Noah. So Noah married to Gia, and in the Sumerian it's Ki. This is why they have In, Ki, An, and Ki. Ki, Gi, Ge. So we have heaven and earth. Heaven and earth had two daughters, and they had two sons. And so there was Isis, who was the wife of Osiris. And then there was Nephiti, which is where we get the word night. Nifit. This is also Asenath that married Joseph. So Joseph married the night. I know, the Canaanite woman dressed in black. The Mary Poppins coming down your chimney to take care of the children. But Nephiti's was Satan's wife, or Yahweh's wife, and he was very abusive. So now remember, Set tried to kill Osiris, death tried to get life, and the great tomb of Osiris there in Egypt was his empty tomb, because Horus, his son, raised him from the dead. But he was called Osiris or Lazarus. So Lazarus is the father, or the high priest, or the king, or the deity. The Egyptian, the Hebrew version of that is Eleazar, was always the name of a high priest. Eleazar, or Lazarus, is the Osiris. Osiris is Adam. But Jesus, you noticed, always had Mary and Martha. Well, so Osiris had a Mary and a Myrti. Mary and Myrti, this is Mary Magdalene and Martha. Now, it's not the Virgin Mother, Mary, because these were Lazarus's daughters, not his wives, but Lazarus had two daughters, and so Osiris had two daughters. That's not Isis or Nephthys, but that's his two daughters. All of these stories are all prophetic, written in the sky, played out in the temples, waiting for the day when it would all be fulfilled by Jesus. And that council, that government that knew all these mysteries, that performed these sacred rituals, the Rex Sacrorum, they were doing it because it is the mysteries of life. It's the reason we're here. But since Jesus has been on the earth, Satan has taken over the world, and we have no idea. He's torn down the pillars. He's taken away the sacred knowledge. He's chased away the woman into the wilderness. But she will have a place prepared by deity in the wilderness for 1,260 days, away from the face of the serpent. Not one hair of her head shall be harmed, and she will be crowned, and there will be a child that will be born, and her child will be the kingdom. Show you what AI says about the Sibylline oracles. A collection of writings is traditionally attributed to ancient Greek prophetesses. Greek prophetesses called Sibyls. You're going to see that there were several of these prophetesses in different towns or locations. This one's called the Sibylline Oracle, but there was the oracles at Delphi. There were other oracles, and they were all very similar to women dancing in frenzied glossolalia, speaking in tongues. And they were Christian in origin. Now look at this. Exhibit a complex relationship with early Christian and Gnostic beliefs. Complex relationship. Only because they don't want to let you know that this is Christianity. So if you take the view that this is not Christianity, early Christianity, down at Luxor, in Thebes, at the Temple of Hathor, which, because they don't know that that is Miriam's, that's Bethlehem, where the prophets, where the king priests were born, where David, where Jesus was born. They don't know any of this, and they're ignoring it on purpose, because literally we saw that they know that Josephus talks about. I mean, how can you explain that there are Jews building temples all the way from down in the Elephantine, Lower Egypt, all the way up to Heliopolis in northern Egypt, which is the entire Egyptian temple range down the Nile? Because there were more than one temple. They weren't like doing it independently. They were all Judeans rebuilding during the days just leading up to Christ. They had a religion there, and it was called, they followed Apis Christ. Well, they had the cross buns, the services like we do today with Easter, the little cross buns and the Easter celebrations of fertility. Basically, the Mass. We're eating the cake at the wedding. That's what Mass is. It started there at Cana when they turned the water into wine, because they had the cake and the wine, and it was the spiritual, alchemist that was changing this material delusion and opening the veil of the woman and becoming one, the atonement, and receiving the higher consciousness. All of these, because AI doesn't know, because nobody in the world seems to know, and this information is not being written in books, they're impervious to all of this information. So they're writing things that make it impossible to figure out that Christianity was the Gnostics. They were the Coptic Egyptian Christians. That's where it started. That's Heliopolis. That's where Jesus was. That's where John was, at the city of John, beyond the River Jordan, in the wilderness, where the woman went down into Egypt, into the wilderness. And so because they're impervious to all of this, they have no idea that these oracles are the speaking in tongues that Paul encountered up there in Ephesus at the temple of Artemis, who had priests called Essenes. Well, the Essene priests started, as we showed, with Deborah, the queen bee, because Essene means a drone bee, and Melissae was the Vestal virgins. The Romans called them Vestal virgins, and the Flamins. The Pontifex Maximus was the high priest over this council of 72, the Sanhedrin. And the king priest, Rex Sacrorum, was something that we no longer have. Because we don't have the mysteries, they put out the flame in 395, and there are no more Vestal virgins. There are no more oracles, because they didn't like truth being spoken. And the unity, they had all things common. The only thing we have left of this is like little groups called the nuns, or a certain group of priests that are celibate. One group takes care of the orphans, and one group studies in writes verses of the Bible or law or legislation. So because they don't know any of this, they have no idea what they're even trying to explain here. But as we see how they explain it, we'll be able to see right through it. Now that we know this, we'll have answers to questions that they think are just mysteries. So it says it has a weird, complex relationship with Christianity. Well, yeah, it's complex if you don't know that after 325, the Christians just hid all of that information. So you don't even know what a pope was, or, anything about these flamens and these priests. We don't know why Peter was the pope and James had a gavel. I mean, like, what in the world is James, the Zadokite priest, doing in the Herod's temple? I mean, why hasn't Christianity ever asked the question that if this was all something that was happening with the Jewish priests in 66 AD at Herod's temple, why would it be talking about virgins? There were no virgins in Herod's temple. And why was Mary, even the Catholic Church says, was a virgin and was the high priest in the temple? But wait a minute, you can't have Mary, a virgin, high priest in Herod's temple. It had to have been the temple that they built at Heliopolis. Leontopolis, it was built on the spot of Heliopolis, that then was rebuilt as the New Jerusalem because it was the original city of Ra. But we as Christians, we read Acts and we see there were 12 apostles and 72 also that he chose. Nobody ever says, wait a minute, that's a Sanhedrin. So where was the Sanhedrin that was reigning that Jesus chose? And why is nobody pointing out that Peter, James, and John was at this council with 72, or the elders, the apostles and the elders met? Where were they meeting? Like, this is the Sanhedrin. Where did they have this Sanhedrin? Shouldn't somebody be telling us, okay, this was not the Jewish Sanhedrin at Herod's temple. So where was it? It was down at Heliopolis. There's no question about this because we know where the Zadokite priests were. Josephus tells us, and all the other historians tell us. The Zadokite priesthood, look it up on your Google. The Zadokite priests from the days of the Maccabees went to Heliopolis, where it was, and rebuilt a temple there, and had prophets and oracles speaking in tongues, and had scripture written. Some of the scripture in the Apocrypha, and I'll show you some of that here in a minute, that they used to believe was scripture. We don't longer read it. Nobody knows what it is. It's from the Sibylline oracles down there in the Coptic area where the Christians were. And so they had a religion of Serapis Christ. Well, what is the religion of Serapis Christ? Why is it identical to Christianity? And why does it have the word Christ on it? And who is this Serapis? Well, Serapis is Osiris Apis. Apis is a snake. Look at your screen, and there is a picture of Serapis Christ. Osiris. Well, he looks a lot like Jesus, doesn't he? You know why? Because all the artwork of, Mary or the Madonna and Child or Serapis Christ, or the depictions that we have, all go back to early Christianity. It's not pagan. It's really Christianity. And remember, John the Baptist was the Pope, or the guy reigning of all of these mystery religions around the world. They set up the same religions. They're all dedicated to the same deities, these grand temples, and it all stems from Heliopolis. So that was Christ. But now if you look on your screen, you see what seems to be his body. That was his head. Nobody wants to show you the body of Serapis Christ. He's Osiris, but he's got the apis. That's the word like a snake. And notice that there are three individuals there. There's a man and a woman, and there is another one in the middle, like a trinity. And they all seem to be apparently serpents. You say, what, Dave? This is ridiculous. You some kind of a pagan? Well, friends, this is the symbolism of astrology. And remember that in the Sumerian and the Egyptian, and even in the Hebrew, we have in the garden, we have a serpent. Well, in the original stories, there was more than one serpent that was in that garden. First of all, Yahweh is also depicted as a serpent because both Jesus and Yahweh are depicted as serpents. And they are in our Old Testament. We have it right there. We have the seraphim. Seraph is the word serpent in Hebrew. So there were two seraphim. Each had 6 wings, a winged serpent. One was covering the west and one covering the east. One is light and one is the darkness. These are the two brothers, Jesus and Satan, and they were both serpents. Now, it doesn't mean that they were evil because they were a serpent. The serpent was cursed in the Garden of Eden to slither on his belly, but the original serpent had wings, phoenix bird, right? The phoenix, or the feathered serpent. And this feathered serpent is wise. We must be as wise as serpents, but as innocent as doves. You see, the serpent was the wisest of all the creatures that the Lord had made. And he told Eve the truth. And this is why Moses put up a serpent in the wilderness on a pole and said, whoever would look upon it shall be saved. And in the New Testament it says that whenever we look upon Jesus on the cross, it says that just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness on a cross, on a pole, so too whoever looketh upon Jesus upon the cross shall be saved. What is it trying to tell us? What is the correlation